Welcome to the Toddcast, bringing you unbiased, student-created, politics-based broadcasting, made possible by the Schar School of Policy and Government.
This week, we're going to be talking about Breonna Taylor, her death, and the explosion of protests that followed.
So, first we're going to discuss what happened to Breonna Taylor. Shortly after midnight on March 13th, plainclothes police officer Hackinson, Mattingly, and Cosgrove, executing the search warrant, forced their way into the apartment where Breonna Taylor was in bed with her boyfriend, Kenneth Walker. The search warrant obtained by police included Ms. Taylor's name and address. Authorities believed her ex-boyfriend, Jamarcus Glover, was involved in a drug ring and had used her apartment to hide narcotics. Mr. Walker fired a shot from his licensed gun, later telling police he thought that Ms. Taylor's ex-boyfriend, Jamarcus Glover, had broken in, according to the New York Times. Officials say Mr. Walker's bullet struck Officer Mattingly, one of the officers, in the leg. The three officers returned fire, discharging 32 rounds, according to the ballistics report from the FBI. Ms. Taylor was shot amid the commotion and died on the hallway floor. No drugs were found at the property, though Jefferson County Prosecutor Thomas Wine said the search was canceled after the shooting. A subsequent police report contained errors, including listing Ms. Taylor's injuries as, quote, none, and saying no force was used to enter when a battering ram had been used. Officer Hankinson was fired from the police after investigators found he had wantonly and blindly fired 10 rounds during the raid, according to his termination letter. Officer Mattingly and Officer Cosgrove were reassigned to administrative duties.
Next, we're going to be talking about the police's account of the event. The Louisville police said that they fired inside Miss Taylor's home only after they were first fired upon by Mr. Walker, Miss Taylor's boyfriend. They said that Mr. Walker wounded one of the officers who was hit in the leg but was expected to make a full recovery. Mr. Walker was subsequently charged with attempted murder of a police officer, though the charge was dismissed in May. The police also asserted that they knocked several times and identified themselves as police officers with a warrant before entering the apartment. Quote, banged on the door, no response. Banged on it again, no response. At that point, we started announcing ourselves, end quote. One of the officers, Sergeant Jonathan Mattingly, said in a March interview that was played before the grand jury. He said the officers banged, quote, 6 or 7 times before breaking into the apartment where Taylor was with her boyfriend. Mr. Walker, Taylor's boyfriend, has said he and Miss Taylor heard aggressive banging at the door and asked who it was, but they did not hear an announcement that it was the police. The police said that officers forced in entry into the exterior door and were immediately met with gunfire. The officers returned fire, the police said. One of the officers, Officer Hankinson, was fired. The other officers involved in the case, Officer Mattingly and Miles Cosgrove, have been placed on administrative reassignment. Detective Miles Cosgrove, who was initially monitoring the exterior of the building, described the chaotic scene as police entered Taylor's apartment in an interview with investigators. Quote, I saw blinding white light and I see blackness at the same time, just dark, deep black, and these vivid white flashes, Cosgrove said. He's one of the 3 officers who fired their weapons that night. FBI analysts determined that a bullet from Cosgrove's gun killed Taylor, according to an earlier news release from the Attorney General. I am almost positive that I fired or was firing during those flashes, during that vivid, blinding white and black colors that I was seeing. Cosgrove can be heard in the recording. Mattingly, who was shot by Taylor's boyfriend, said he saw a man and a woman inside, about 20 feet away. The male was in a stretched-out position with his hand on a gun, and as soon as I cleared the doorway, he fires a gun, the sergeant said. As soon as the shot hit, I could see the heat in my leg. I could feel the heat in my leg, so I returned fire, he said as well. In one recording, Lieutenant Sean Hoover told investigators in March that Mattingly returned fire before colleagues dragged the wounded officer, bleeding heavily from his thigh, out into a parking lot and used a belt as a tourniquet. Mr. Hankinson appealed his firing, but a hearing from the case has been delayed pending the completion of a criminal justice investigation.
So now we want to discuss what have been the subsequent charges. A grand jury indicted a former Louisville police officer in late September for wanton endangerment for his actions during the raid. He pleaded not guilty. No charges were announced against the other 2 officers who fired shots, and no one was charged for causing Ms. Taylor's death. Under Kentucky law, someone is guilty of wanton endangerment if they can commit an act that shows, quote, an extreme indifference to the value of human life. In announcing the results of his investigation, Kentucky Attorney General Daniel Cameron said the 2 officers had been, quote, justified to protect themselves, and the justification bars us from pursuing criminal charges. As part of the financial settlement won by Ms. Taylor's family, a series of police reforms have been rolled out in Louisville. One change is that all search warrants must now be approved by a senior officer. It is a felony that can come with a 5-year sentence for each count. The officers who entered Ms. Taylor's apartment were not wearing body cameras, and the Louisville Metro Police Department has now made it compulsory for all officers to wear them. City officials also banned the use of no-knock warrants on June 11th.
Following the incident, there's been a grand jury, which we're going to be talking about now. On October 2nd, recordings of about 15 hours from the grand jury inquiry were released. The audio files have begun to shed light on what evidence jurors considered when choosing to indict Officer Hankinson and declining to bring charges against the other police officers involved in the shooting. Grand jurors heard at least 2 police officers who were at the raid on Ms. Taylor's apartment say the group knocked and announced their presence several times before breaking down the door. Those accounts have been questioned by several of Ms. Taylor's neighbors and her boyfriend. Detective Cosgrove said officers knocked for 90 seconds and that the volume escalated from gentle knocking to forceful pounding to pounding while yelling, "Police." For 1 to 2 minutes, Detective Michael Noble said he knocked and announced himself to the police before entering, using a battering ram to force his way into Ms. Taylor's apartment. Grand jurors were played recordings of radio calls from Officer Hankinson, as well as 911 calls made after the shooting began. The calls suggest that Officer Hankinson believed that Sergeant Mattingly had been wounded by someone with an AR who was barricaded inside the apartment. Officer Hankinson's reference to quote-unquote AR on the call appears to be a reference to either an assault rifle or the AR-15, a type of military-style semi-automatic rifle. Grand jurors also raised several questions, including if Mr. Walker had been named in the search warrant. In parentheses, he had not. Close parentheses. What exactly the officers saw when the apartment door opened and whether the officers executing the warrant were aware that the police had already found Officer Glover. At times, the jurors' questions suggested that they were skeptical of photos and videos they were being shown. The release of the recordings came after one of the grand jurors filed a court motion that asked for the proceedings to be made public. The juror also accused Kentucky's Attorney General Daniel Cameron of using the jurors as a shield to deflect accountability and responsibility. Mr. Cameron has insisted that jurors were given all of the evidence.
Following the story of Breonna Taylor, there was a huge rise on social media discussing the events of that night, and the hashtag Justice for Breonna Taylor started. So now we're going to sort of discuss the impact of her case and her death on social media. So on June 5th, which would have been Miss Taylor's 27th birthday, many people used the hashtag Say Her Name to remember her and raise awareness about her case. The Say Her Name movement also brings awareness to other Black women whose similar stories may have not garnered as much national attention, including Tanisha Anderson and Tatiana Jefferson. Say Her Name attempts to make the death of Black women an active part of this conversation by saying their names. Kimberly Crenshaw, an activist and creator of the hashtag, told ABC. If Black lives really do matter, all Black lives have to matter. That means Black lives across gender have to be lifted up. WNBA players have also used their platform to bring attention to Ms. Taylor's case. This season is dedicated to her, and players have been wearing jerseys bearing her name. We have also seen tennis player Naomi Osaka wear a face mask with her name on it when she was in the U.S. Open.
Following the tragic death of Breonna Taylor, there's also been several protests to combat the rulings that have been in place since her death. For more than 120 days now, protesters have been gathering in downtown Louisville, Jefferson Square Park, calling for racial justice and charges against the officers involved in the police killing of Breonna Taylor. Protests erupted in Louisville and across the country after Kentucky Attorney General Daniel Cameron announced Wednesday that a grand jury did not charge the 3 officers directly with Taylor's death, more than 6 months after police shot her in her home while executing a search warrant. From spring to summer, and now to fall, the small plaza that sits in front of the Kentucky City Semester Hall and Hall of Justice has been a place for protesters to gather, mourn, rally, and at times celebrate. Its heart is an always growing and changing memorial to Breonna Taylor, filled with artwork and messages. In Louisville, curfew is in effect, and the National Guard has been called in. Downtown businesses are mostly boarded up, and the city has blocked off streets leading to much of the city center. More than 150 people have been arrested in recent days. Protesters say that they are undeterred and will keep pushing for racial justice and keep saying Breonna Taylor's name.
The story of Breonna Taylor is a tragic one, and unfortunately, it's not the only one that we've heard of, but this one has been the one that has garnered the most national attention and even international attention. And it's important for us to talk about it here because we cannot forget. We cannot let this slide because it will occur again if we don't make sure that her death was not in vain and that we don't protect other Black women the same way that Breonna Taylor should have been protected. I think that's why it's important to continue to spread this message and to continue to say her name and to continue talking about it, because unfortunately, this isn't just one incident. This is a recurring thing that a lot of Black women have to deal with and live in fear of.
Yeah, I think especially after George Floyd and the massive protest that came after that, it's the fact that there's like another one coming after, and then this one as well, not having the sense of justice that I think the protesters are really looking for in the indictment and the conviction of the officers involved in her death and in George Floyd's death as well. And I think it's just the continued not charging of the police officers that is really just lit the fire of the protesters and like honestly people all over the world, because it's like, how can this happen? How can, a woman just be like in her home in her own bedroom and then still lose her life? And it's so just the factors surrounding her death and what happened, it just really like makes you think like, oh my goodness, like where are you safe, And so it's just like you said, like to be Black woman in the US can be like a really just dangerous thing sometimes just to exist. And so I think this is also another good example of that, and just an example of the structures in place in the US justice system that in a sense perpetuate racist thoughts, or just racist structures that don't always give Black people the same freedoms or rights that people wouldn't normally associate with like just like humans. And so the hope is that things get better. And I think just the fact that we came from George Floyd in March, and now we're in October, and even with Breonna Taylor, like the incident with her death was in March as well, and it's just the fact that we're in October now and that things really haven't changed for the better. It can just be really disappointing and disconcerting, but it's almost comforting to see that people are still keeping this issue alive and well, and that people in Louisville have not forgotten and are not forgetting Breonna Taylor's name anytime soon.
Also, another important thing that I just reminded of while you were speaking was like you mentioned, there are a lot of rights that people don't really think that Black women don't have, because the assumption is that now everybody has equal rights and everybody's treated the same way, but you and I both know that that doesn't really happen. And one of those things especially is, I'm going to also put additional information about this, even though it's slightly off topic, but I think it's also important to mention. I'll add that in the description. Black women are more likely to die during childbirth than any other race, because they're often not listened to when they discuss certain pain, or if they're not feeling well, or if something they think is off. Their doctors will more likely to ignore them, and that leads to their death. And these are situations where they're in a place where they're supposed to be helped and they're supposed to be looked after. And if this is how they're treated in a hospital setting, then we can't even imagine how they're treated by police and by law enforcement. So it's something that we should continue to speak about and we should continue to bring awareness to, because this is just one area, but it reflects nationally on how Black women are treated.
Yeah, it's definitely scary, especially like what you're bringing up, like the levels of maternal deaths for Black women in the States, like rival that of third world countries. And like that's not something you would put with the United States, like having mothers die during childbirth. That shouldn't be something that they're at the bottom of the lists for. And so just like small things that people don't really recognize or understand, that like when people say Black Lives Matter, this is what they're trying to be like this is what they're trying to bring attention to, the different ways in which Black lives are either at risk or their lives aren't given the same amount of weight in terms of importance in stations and situations where there really shouldn't be a discussion on the type of service or the type of attention that they're given. So as terrible as the situation is with Breonna Taylor and the loss of her life, because she really was a bright young woman with an incredible future ahead of her, I think this situation brings attention to the things we were talking about. And this is also like a continuation of our first episode talking about the Black Lives Matter movement, but just the fact that this is something that hasn't left the media, I think just gives them hope that this is not a situation that people are going to just make a hashtag and leave. You know, there's a lot more action-based protesting that's happening. It's not just all performative. And I think that just really gives me some comfort to know that, like, okay, this is not just a thing that people are spamming just because it's on their timeline, but this is like something that people has grabbed their attention and that they're going to be continuing to talk about and try and bring action to for longer than this.
Yeah, absolutely. And to add to that too, the thing that I think needs to end right here, right now, with not just with the Breonna Taylor case, but any case where we discuss the health and safety of Black women, is the let's give Black women the right to be able to speak their minds and to be able to speak their truths without labeling them as angry or as crazy or as all of these hurtful and damaging stereotypes that are always placed on Black women. I feel like, yes, this is, again, still a little bit off topic, but I always feel like I need to bring it up when we're talking about situations like these, because oftentimes these titles of like angry or aggressive are put onto Black women for literally no reason, and it's racist and it's really, really damaging. And if there's any takeaway to take from this, it's to take a look into yourself and take a look at how you in your past have unknowingly put labels on people or have stereotyped people, and try to make sure that you're being conscious of that. Try to make sure that you are giving people the benefit of the doubt, that you're giving them the chance to express themselves without preemptively putting your own thoughts onto them. But yeah, with that, I hope you guys enjoyed this podcast. We have all the links that we used for the research for this podcast in the description down below, as well as our social media if you're interested to know more about the Toddcast or about the Schar Undergraduate Student Organization. If there's anything else you would like to add, Imani?
No, I think we went through all of it.
All right, awesome. So if you like this episode, please give us a like and please tell us what you think in the comments down below. We'll also link the last week's episode that we discussed the next stimulus check. And we'll join us next week again, Monday at 5 p.m. Bye.
Bye.